Everyone is watching the Strait of Hormuz. Everyone is watching the carrier strike groups and the mine-clearing drones and the diplomatic standoffs. But while the cameras are pointed at the water, there is a crisis quietly unfolding inside the US military that almost nobody is talking about. And it might be the most dangerous story of this entire war. Here's the number that should stop you cold: 850. That is how many Tomahawk cruise missiles the United States has already fired in this conflict, in just 6 weeks. And here's the number that puts that into terrifying context. The US military, in a normal year, buys roughly 90 Tomahawk missiles. That means in 6 weeks of war with Iran, the United States burned through nearly a decade's worth of its most powerful long-range strike weapon. In 4 weeks alone, the Pentagon launched more than 850 Tomahawks, the most ever expended in a single military campaign in American history, surpassing even the 802 fired across the entire duration of Operation Iraqi Freedom. And the war isn't over. The blockade just started today. And here's the question that Pentagon officials, defense analysts, and military strategists are all quietly asking behind closed doors. What happens if China watches all of this, waits for America's magazine to run low, and then moves on Taiwan? Because that is exactly the nightmare scenario this missile shortage has just made more plausible. And it's why the story of the Tomahawk isn't just a Navy procurement story. It's a story about whether the United States can fight 2 wars at once. Spoiler, right now, the honest answer is not as clearly yes as it used to be. To understand why this shortage is so serious, you first need to understand what makes the Tomahawk so indispensable, and why you can't just build more of them overnight. The Tomahawk is not a simple weapon. It is a ship-launched, long-range, terrain-following cruise missile that can travel over 1,000 miles and strike with pinpoint accuracy, even against targets protected by sophisticated air defense systems. It has a 1,000-pound warhead, meaning it delivers somewhere between 10 and 20 times the destructive force of a typical combat drone. It can be guided via satellite mid-flight, can find a moving target while airborne, and crucially, it can be fired from ships and submarines far outside the range of enemy air defenses. That flexibility is everything. You don't need an air base in the region. You don't need to fly aircraft through contested airspace. You park a destroyer or submarine in international waters, and you strike targets 1,000 miles inland. That is why the Tomahawk was the very first weapon fired on day 1 of Operation Epic Fury, used to tear apart Iran's integrated air defense network before a single-manned aircraft entered Iranian airspace. It is the key that opens the door for everything else. And it was used to stunning effect. Estimates hold that as many as 400 Tomahawks were fired in just the first 72 hours of the war, alone roughly 10% of the entire US ready-to-fire inventory gone in 3 days, at the pre-war annual production rate of just 90 missiles per year. Those first 3 days alone would take 5 years of normal manufacturing to replace. 5 years for 3 days of war. That production gap is the heart of the crisis. And understanding why the US got here requires understanding just how broken the defense industrial base has become. Here's where most people assume the fix is simple: just spend more money and build faster. But defense analysts who have studied this problem say that is exactly the kind of thinking that gets countries into trouble. Because the Tomahawk shortage isn't primarily a money problem. It's a structural problem baked deep into the US defense industrial base, and it cannot be solved with a budget line item. There are 3 critical bottlenecks that make rapid Tomahawk production essentially impossible in the short term. First, the solid rocket motor supply chain is extraordinarily thin. Only a handful of specialized subcontractors in the entire country are capable of manufacturing the propulsion systems, and they cannot simply surge output overnight. Second, each Tomahawk contains thousands of precision components, advanced seekers, terrain-matching sensors, guidance systems, many of which rely on single-source suppliers. If one supplier can't deliver, the entire production line stalls. And third, the production lines themselves have been running cold for years. Past government decisions to slow, pause, and cut orders led manufacturers to maintain bare minimum output, just enough to keep the lines alive. You cannot flip a switch and suddenly produce 1,000 missiles a year when the workforce, the tooling, and the supply chain have been operating at skeleton crew levels for over a decade. Each Tomahawk currently takes between 2 and 4 years to build from purchase order to delivery. A new agreement signed in February 2026 aims to put production up to 1,000 missiles per year. But analysts at the American Enterprise Institute have been blunt. The target is necessary, but there is not a chance the industrial base can currently support it. The US is essentially trying to sprint when its legs have been in a cast for years, and the consequences are already rippling internationally. Japan ordered roughly 400 Tomahawk missiles from the United States, an order that was supposed to be completed by March 2028. That delivery is now facing serious delays because America needs to replenish its own stockpile first. America's allies are now less armed because of this war. That is not a small problem. So let's zoom out to the big picture, because the Tomahawk shortage doesn't just matter for the Iran conflict. It matters for the entire global balance of power over the next several years. The Navy's fiscal 2027 budget request tells you everything you need to know about how alarmed the Pentagon actually is. Congress approved $257 million for just 58 Tomahawk missiles in 2026. The Navy is now asking for $3 billion for 785 missiles, a 1,200% increase in procurement. Total weapons spending requested jumped from roughly $10 billion to over $22 billion in a single budget cycle. These are not incremental adjustments. These are emergency numbers. And even if Congress approves every dollar tomorrow, the best independent estimate from the Center for Strategic and International Studies is that it will still take 2 to 3 years to replace the 850 missiles already fired. 2 to 3 years of reduced Tomahawk inventory. 2 to 3 years during which, if China decides to move on Taiwan, the United States Navy will show up to that fight with lighter magazines than at any point in recent history. Analysts have called the opening phase of the Iran war an empty rack crisis, a scenario where the forward-deployed ships of the US Navy simply run out of Tomahawks in the vertical launch cells mid-conflict, with no way to reload quickly enough to matter. The Navy has pivoted by leaning harder on B-1B Lancer bombers, carrying cheaper AGM-158JA SSM missiles to reduce Tomahawk expenditure going forward. But those are different weapons with different capabilities, not a direct substitute. The Payne Institute estimated it will take at least 5 years to fully replenish what was fired in just the first 16 days of the war. 5 years. And the blockade, announced just yesterday, means the fighting isn't done. Every day the Navy is out there enforcing that blockade, facing potential IRGC provocations, is another day where the calculus of America's missile inventory gets a little more uncomfortable. The Iran war was supposed to be a demonstration of American power, and in many ways it has been. But it has also revealed, for the first time in public, the gap between what the United States can start and what it can sustain. The Tomahawk shortage is the military's hidden bill for this war, and unlike the ceasefire, the blockade, or the negotiations, this one can't be solved in a conference room in Islamabad.